Don't move to Canton, Georgia before you understand these facts. Right off the bat, I've got a checklist for you that you really need to look up before you move here with any area or any home that you plan on moving to. You really need to look up these checklist items here that I've got for you. First one is the school boundaries. In Canton, the school boundaries are kind of like all over the place. You could be on one side of the road in a neighborhood and be in one school district, and you could be on the other side of the road in the same neighborhood and be a completely different school district, a completely different county even. And so certainly something that you got to check on when you're moving to Canton. Another one is flood zones. There are a lot of creeks and rivers, a lot of waterways. I know this sounds surprising to many people, but they are all over Metro Atlanta, especially in Canton because of the Etowah River. And so you want to make sure you're not in a flood zone. Another big one is the HOA rules and the HOA costs. Almost all of the homes in Canton are in an HOA. And so it's super important that you understand how much those HOAs are and what they're covering. Another big one is whether the home is on sewer or septic. This is kind of a country, farther out area, Canton, and so Canton sometimes has some of the homes on septic tanks and some of the homes are on sewers, so certainly something to check out. Another item on my checklist here is the internet speeds. Again, this is kind of a farther out area, and so some areas you might be dealing with cable internet, some areas you might be dealing with AOL. I'm just kidding. Fiber internet. Sometimes you see fiber internet on some of the neighborhoods. There's been fiber laid, and then some of the neighborhoods do not have fiber, and so certainly something to look up there. And then another big one on my checklist here is future development plans. Canton is growing very, very quickly. And so there is always some kind of plans in the works there in Canton because of the population boom that they have going on there. And so if you plan on living in a home that's not in a neighborhood, you really want to be careful of that, because in a neighborhood, you're kind of protected from like development. They're not going to widen the road in your neighborhood, you know, but if you don't live in a neighborhood, they could be widening that road or doing some kind of construction there in front of your home. Your home could even become obsolete. Like that's a thing here in Georgia. You could buy a home that is on like a quiet road, but then they widen that road to like a 4-lane highway, and all of a sudden you'll never be able to sell that home again. So you got to really be careful about what part of Canton you're living in and checking for those future development. What's up, y'all? My name is Victor with Atlanta Suburban Living. We put out videos every week about what it's like to live in Atlanta and the suburbs around Atlanta. Another fact that you really need to understand when it comes to Canton is the infrastructure issue. And so because Canton is farther out away from Atlanta, it's really not completely country, but it is much more of a quiet suburban area. And so this kind of means that some of the infrastructure is not really caught up to the amount of population in this city. Canton has very quickly become a very popular city to move to, rightfully so. I think Canton is one of the best suburbs in all of Metro Atlanta. In fact, I keep trying to convince my wife that we need to move to Canton. I love that area, but a lot of people love that area. And so the infrastructure in Canton is still from like the 70s or 80s or whatever it is that they put those power lines down, and like the sewer lines and all those things. And so it has not really been able to keep up with the amount of population growth in this city. And so that is kind of an issue, especially when you're driving down the road and you see the power lines are all like above ground. You know, they don't have the power lines buried. And so this kind of makes some of the areas or some of the neighborhoods unsightly. Certainly something to think about if you plan on moving here. If you plan on moving to Canton, or you just have any questions about what it's like to live here, feel free to call, text, or email me anytime. I'm a local realtor here in the area. Thank you so much to everybody who has reached out. I'm always happy to help. Even if you just have a question about what it's like to live here, happy to help. Another one is definitely going to be how far the city of Canton is from the city of Atlanta. If you lived in Canton and you plan on driving to Atlanta, that's a long ass commute, especially going down Interstate 75, which is notorious for having some of the worst rush hour traffic. You could be looking at an hour and a half one way to get to work. I mean, if there was a bad enough traffic jam, maybe 2 hours one way to get to Atlanta for work. And so there are some alternatives here. You could very well live in Canton and work in like Marietta. Marietta has lots of employers. It's a very big city. Or you could also live in Canton and work in Alpharetta. Alpharetta also has lots of employers, a big tech industry there as well. And so this would cut down the commute to like half. You would not have to deal with a 2-hour commute to work. You'd only have to deal with an hour commute. An hour commute to work. I don't know if that's any better, but it certainly would be a little better than having to drive all the way down to Atlanta. Another thing to keep in mind if you are planning on moving to Canton is the downtown area and like the mill on Etowah. This is like a shopping area that they have that's very close to downtown Canton. They are cool and very easy to walk around, and they have lots of shops and restaurants there, and so it kind of has a little bit of a city feel. This is very different than the rest of Canton. You don't want to confuse these areas, especially like the downtown part of Canton, and think that the rest of Canton has this same vibe. It is a very completely different vibe outside of the downtown area of Canton. It's more like a quiet suburban area in Canton where you're going to be driving almost everywhere. You're going to certainly be car dependent if you live in Canton. This is like the norm here in Metro Atlanta. Now, if you lived close to downtown Canton, you know, you could certainly have that easy walkability to all of those shops and restaurants. Certainly possible. But again, you don't want to confuse the downtown area and think that the rest of Canton is like this. It's much quieter and much more rural outside of downtown Canton. Another thing to understand here about this city before you move here is that the cost of homes here is increasing very quickly. Again, it's becoming a very popular city to live in. And so right now, the average 3-bed, 2-bath home in Canton is right around $550 sold price in the last 3 to 6 months. And so $550 is pretty typical in Canton. For a 4-bed, 3-bath home, you may be looking at closer to $650. So certainly one of the best suburbs in all of Metro Atlanta, but that price tag is there as well. And then another one to remember is that you don't want to live outside of a neighborhood. You could live outside of a neighborhood if you've got enough land separating you from the road or separating you from some of the neighbors. Maybe that's a little less risky, but inside the neighborhoods is far less of a risk in an area that has a lot of development going on. By far one of the best ways to really understand what any city is like, especially Canton, is to come and visit the city and to like walk the streets and see and meet some of the people. This is a very helpful way to understand the vibe of a city and the vibe of Canton, and downtown Canton is going to be a great way, a great place to visit to really understand that city. So of course it can be difficult to make that drive or that flight all the way to Canton just to see or feel what this city is like. So I went on a walking tour of the city, made a whole video about like the tour of the downtown Canton area so you can really get a first person look at what this city is like. You can check out that video right here. I'll see you in the next one.